Hey there guys, this is Richard, your host, with another marvelous video. Killian is by far one of the fiercest villains in the entire franchise, including the movies and the innumerable comics. He's not your run-of-the-mill villain who's all brawn and no brains. Killian is someone who's equal parts intelligent, ruthless, and dangerous. The 2014 Robocop comic picks up right after the ending of the first movie. The basic plot revolves around Killian, an ex-convict who tries to take advantage of the OCP's new gun control laws to further his own agenda. However, he has an age-old relationship with the old man, something that allows Killian to manipulate the old man. You're not going to believe what this connection is. So, let's get straight to exploring the 12 issues of this awesome comic that is nothing short of a spiritual successor to Paul Verhoeven's original. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our comment, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. Killian meets Robocop, the boogeyman for bad men. The comic begins with all the tropes of a Robocop story, and the first words that we read are, "I'd buy that for $1." Well, if you have Verhoeven's original, you'll know what I'm talking about. Our guy, Killian, is introduced as a prisoner who recently got released. Most men who spend a lot of time in prison come out looking for religion or something like that, but Killian was different. He'd been a bad guy since forever, and his release didn't change that. He'd already killed a guy in the prison with a dumbbell and was looking for more of the same. While drinking beer on the streets, Killian asks his friend where the party was, which was basically his idea of the latest chaos in Detroit. He'd not raised hell in Detroit and was hungry for more, but the other dude was kinda morose about the whole crime scene in Detroit. You see, there was a new guy in town, and his name was Robocop. Killian had only heard about the guy in prison and thought it was some boogeyman that the cops of Detroit conjured out of thin air to scare the bad guys. So, Killian and his friend take a little stroll to find out who or what exactly Robocop is. The next panel takes us to a SWAT undercover sting that went really bad and spiraled down into a hostage situation with the bad guys raining fire on the cops. And the worst part was that the sting was for guns, but the cops weren't all that worried. I mean, they had Mr. Murphy with them on their side. Inside the building, the leader of the gang was getting a bit cocky about how he'd take care of the cyborg cop, but he was grossly underestimating his adversary. The half-machine, half-human cop slowly walked into the building with his thumping steps. You see, he was never one to care much about stealth. He compensated for that with sheer strength, weapons, and an uber-cool personality. The poor fellow tried using a grenade against Robocop, which of course didn't work, and one punch from the metallic law enforcer dislodged the gang leader's left eye and several teeth. The other gang members wanted to avenge their leader's death and opened fire, but Murphy's titanium alloy armor took the punishment with ease. It didn't take Robocop too long to send them all to their makers. Killian had seen exactly what Robocop was and could do. He concluded that when you're new in the yard, you take the big dog first. You just walk up and kick them in the nuts. I'm not sure if Robocop had them intact, but I guess it's the thought that counts. Killian sees Robocop do that cowboy gun spinning thing, and I think he was impressed with the move. Killian had found what he was looking for, and Robocop didn't stop the party. In fact, he was the party. Killian, the citizen liaison. Back at the station, we find Officer Lewis preparing for her detective examination, but no one apart from the Sarge knew about this. Another cop believed that she should tell Murphy since they were pretty tight, and that he'd find it difficult after she was gone to the higher circles in plain clothes and wearing gold watches. But Robocop would always be on the streets, shooting potential bad guys in their penises and taking them with him. The bad guys. Not the penises. So, of course, the comic is building up for a drama between the two partners. But here comes the more important plot point. Lewis informs Murphy that there's a potential armed robbery in progress and asks him if he wants to come along. Well, yes, lady. What a stupid question that is. But upon reaching the spot, they were a bit shocked to see what was happening. It was a SWAT team confiscating guns from an arms dealer. The men informed Lewis and Murphy that any weapon not registered with both the OCP and the city of Detroit was to be confiscated. Lewis's database didn't honor this new law. It went against her programming, and the same went for Murphy. To make things worse, Lewis was put in charge of running the whole show, mostly Robocop, but she was to lend any help he'd require. Later that day, executives from OCP and the city's mayor landed at the station to brief the partners. Robocop had saved the new mayor in the last movie, when Councilman Miller held him hostage. The new law was a part of the city amendment when they got permission to start experimenting with OCP's robotics division within city limits. And the last shootout downtown, which Robocop stopped, served as a catalyst for the enforcement of the new law. Murphy objected to this. She wasn't against having fewer guns on the streets, but she knew that they'd be lynched if they went around confiscating guns from criminals. To help with this, the top brass had set up a special council of concerned citizens, including community leaders, to help with the transition. This was when the mayor introduced the new citizen liaison, Killian. This time around, he was dressed like a businessman, but what was his game? What did he want? Let's find out. Killian's long game. This guy liked to play the long game. He wasn't someone who was all brawn and no brains. Killian used both. Despite being the citizen liaison who was supposed to be helping the Detroit Police Department get the guns off the streets, he instigated the people against it, and the cops couldn't do anything about it, you see. He was well within his rights to call a public gathering and put forth his opinion. According to him, the police in Detroit were so inept that they had to bring one back from the dead and turn him into a machine to help solve the crime problem. He said there was just one Robocop, and he couldn't protect all the citizens, so they needed to be armed if they wanted to protect themselves. Furthermore, although guns were getting harder to procure for criminals, they were resorting to using toy guns to threaten people, so the crime rate hadn't dropped by any significant amount. From Killian's crowd, a man named Hutch expressed his disapproval of the new law, saying that his store was his life and he'd lose everything if a group of thugs decided to break in. Killian was openly challenging Robocop, but in a passive-aggressive way. Killian knew that the city was turning into a powder keg, needing only a small spark to go kaboom. Traits of the perfect anarchist. This guy could be the Joker of Robocop's Detroit. In the next panel, we're taken to southern Michigan, where a biker gang enters a roadside bar. They misbehave with the waitress and also commit the mistake of dubbing a trucker named Nash as old. The man beat them to a pulp before having his boys run over their bikes with a monster truck, and the trio was heading to Detroit. Naturally, something was up. Back at the station, Murphy finally learned that Lewis was trying for a promotion, but Robocop dismissed her defense by saying that she didn't care. On the other hand, Hutch was closing his liquor store for the day when Nash and his men broke into the store. Not surprisingly, Killian, too, arrived at the store. Hutch was happy to see him, but little did he know that Killian would use him as the spark for an explosion that would become the cause of Detroit losing all semblances of law and order. But what does Killian get out of plunging Detroit into the darkness of violence and anarchy? Killian's past is deeply rooted in his present. 25 years ago, Killian and Nash used to be partners in crime. Although Killian was someone who always tried to know everything about his dealings, this one time he got a mysterious benefactor who gave him a large supply of guns to sell, and Killian just couldn't say no to it. However, their go-down was ambushed by cops, who seized everything and put Killian and Nash behind bars. While Nash broke out of prison after killing a dozen guards, Killian served the entire sentence. And now the two of them had, once again, started working together. Meanwhile, Robocop, Lewis, and Mason find out about Hutch and connect the dots to Killian, since they'd seen Killian speak to Hutch the previous day. Although they didn't have any solid proof, they wanted to act on this hunch. So, Robocop and Lewis go to the precinct to find files on Killian. Strangely, all of Killian's files had been deleted from the system, but who did it and why? Nevertheless, Lewis suggested they go old school and look through the hard copies. Since these files hadn't been organized in years, no one would go through the trouble of removing Killian's papers. On the other hand, Killian was back where his story had started. The man had somehow gotten hold of all the seized weapons and was planning to sell them to various groups of people. Some of it was going to be sold to rebels in war-torn countries, and the rest was to be divided into two halves, one of which would be sold in other cities, and the other would find its way back to the streets of Detroit. Killian had to leave to make another public appearance, but before that, he left the consignments in Nash's care and gave him a set of instructions. Meanwhile, Mason gets radioed in about a situation at Hutch's Liquor. He was asking for backup, and since Mason was just there, he and his partner turned around, only to find out that a large crowd of protesters had gathered at the spot, demanding that their weapons be returned to them with immediate effect. And of course, Killian was fueling their rage and instigating them. Mason rescued Detective Jansen, but the mob had gone out of control. Now, they were using Molotov cocktails to torch vehicles. Murphy and Lewis reach Killian's den, where Murphy asks her to stay back as the situation might turn out to be dangerous. However, she says that they were a team and she was tagging along. To this end, Murphy takes a dig at Lewis and says, "It is not I who is leaving the team." Clearly, the robot man wasn't happy about Lewis was doing, so being passive-aggressive was the way forward. No further comments. Anyway, they had more pressing issues at hand, so they carried on, only to find a network of tunnels that were spread all across Detroit, and a few of these tunnels connected to other cities as well. It's not until they realized the truth about the confiscated guns. Robocop followed fresh tire tracks into one of the tunnels but got rammed by the same monster truck that had previously obliterated the bikes. Robocop was badly injured and found himself surrounded by Nash and his boys. Number 5. The long game. The men tied Robocop to their truck using a chain and dragged him around while Nash was interrogating Lewis about how they found out about the location. Lewis, being Lewis, spat on Nash's face, which was a blow to the old man's ego. Meanwhile, Robocop's condition wasn't looking too good. but Nash wanted to do to Lewis what he was doing to Murphy, and he knew that she would not survive it. Nash's men realized that Robocop had broken free and that they were about to be fed for good. Robocop broke through the truck and smashed the two men's heads into each other's. Wild stuff. Next thing we know, Lewis used Nash's moment of distraction, snatched the old man's gun, and shot him in the head. Right about now, Robocop learned that a riot had broken out in the city, and the partners correctly assumed that the confiscated guns were heading straight to the riot. No cop could possibly control thousands of angry people on the streets demanding their guns back, so they had to be given something to keep them calm. When Lewis reached the spot, she told the people that the OCP and the mayor had reconsidered their demands and would reverse the gun laws in a few days. But this was a blatant lie, and Lewis had just plunged herself into a pool of crap that was slowly rising above her neck. Lewis was nearly sure that she was getting fired, let alone promoted to detective. However, after her little stunt, she'd been perceived as a hero of sorts, and firing her would have become a PR nightmare. So OCP and the mayor decided to go along with what she'd announced. In fact, they even promoted her to detective and put her in charge of all the unsolved murders in the city of Detroit, because that would keep her away from the investigation. Interestingly enough, this had all been orchestrated by just one man. Yep, Killian. But why? Well, Killian had been stealing technology and R&D from OCP for weeks now and orchestrated the whole gun law thing to distract OCP and the cops from looking into this stuff. He was really playing the game of chess with OCP's old man and was getting one step closer to having his own version of Robocop. To make things worse, OCP and the mayor decided that after the day's events, Robocop's sidearm was to be confiscated for good, leaving him unarmed. Now, this was just the 4th issue of the comic, and things are looking pretty tight already. The story has been building up pretty nicely. Killian is serving as the mastermind of a long conspiracy, and Robocop's claws are being chopped off. Ed 2000X, the granddaddy of OCP weapons. Killian's partner Wyatt and a few others broke into a bank, but this time around they were wearing helmets that resembled Robocop's. But what did these helmets do? Well, they controlled Ed 209. Yep, the enforcement droid from the original Robocop movie. The men guided the droid to shoot through the bank's vault so that they could steal the money. However, as fate would have it, Robocop appeared on the scene, armed with a baton. Despite having just the baton, Robocop managed to destroy Ed 209, but the money was gone. The number of casualties was high and included cops as well as civilians. No one really knew how it was that a few street thugs could get hold of an Ed 209, a military-grade technology. Jansen was fairly impressed by Robocop's achievements in taking down an Ed, with nothing but a glorified stick that OCP gave him. On the other hand, Robocop was getting batoned by the media about questions about Lewis and the birth of an underground and completely evil OCP. Back at the precinct, the Sarge knew very well that Killian was bad news, and Lewis was also restless because she'd been tied to a desk. However, these were the good guys, and they wanted to do something about the whole mess Killian was creating. So, the Sarge was sending Mason undercover into Killian's camp to find out more about the newly resurfaced evil. This was the last resort because they needed to find out what Killian was up to, and they were not going to get any help from the higher-ups, OCP, or the mayor. Furthermore, they were all putting their jobs and lives on the line, because if the seniors knew what they were doing, all their jobs would be served on a platter. Additionally, Robocop had been given a lot of punishment from Ed 209 and was in dire need of a massive overhaul, but that would need permission from OCP's old man. All of this was enraging Lewis in her bones, and she wanted to do something about it. But seeing that there was no solution in sight and no one to help her out, she finally decided to take matters into her own hands. She arrived at one of OCP's Superman correctional facilities to speak to the truck drivers who were taking away the confiscated guns for Killian. You see, they were a loyal bunch and didn't rat Killian out, but he'd planned their murder inside prison to ensure that there were no loose ends. Unfortunately, before Lewis could speak to them, they were executed before her eyes by a few other prisoners. Meanwhile, Robocop gets a call about another bank robbery, and he heads out to take care of it. However, this time around, White and his men were not in for the money. They just wanted to bring Robocop to a hunting ground. But who was going to do the hunting? Well, Killian had managed to find himself an upgraded version of Ed 209. This bad boy was called Ed 2000X. But here's the real kicker. You remember how I earlier said that Killian had a mysterious benefactor supplying him with guns? Well, it was none other than OCP's old man who hired Killian to sell illegal guns to other countries to fund OCP. And now Killian was using this as leverage against the old man to further his own agenda. Robocop suffers a life-changing loss. So, Ed 2000X went all guns blazing on Robocop, and mind you, the robot had a lot of guns. I mean, a lot. Since it was nothing like Robocop, there was going to be a hell lot of collateral damage. Despite being under heavy fire, Our cyborg cop was asking the citizens to stay indoors. Wyatt and this sadistic bunch of thugs were recording the events as Robocop was taking a heavy rain of fire from Ed 2000X. Robocop warned to use heavy fire if the firing did not cease, but he was clearly the underdog right now, and it looked like this warning was rather useless. But they didn't kill Robocop. They got what they needed. Robocop on his knees, waiting to meet his maker. Meanwhile, Lewis reached Hutch's liquor store to investigate further. She knew that it was the place where everything started, and that the place would have something to hide that could incriminate Killian. Here, Lewis bumped into Detective Jansen, who asked what Lewis was doing there, since she'd been moved to the Unsolved Crimes desk, to which Lewis noted that Hutch's case hadn't been solved yet, which gave her the jurisdiction to visit his store. Interestingly, Jansen invited Lewis to dinner that evening. When Lewis asked why, all Jansen said was that they would discuss her career as a detective. Pretty fishy. Meanwhile, Mason had reached the tunnels to join Killian's team. Killian was always looking for able-bodied men who could hold guns. After a bit of grilling and threatening Mason about being a snitch, he was inducted into the group and was asked by Killian to show his shooting skills. Mason, on the other hand, was shocked to see the extent of what Killian had achieved. He had an entire armory of high-end assault weapons that he wanted to put on Ed 2000X's back. Of course, he was happy to learn from Wyatt what Ed 2000X had done to Robocop. Killian was proud of his achievement. He'd built a better robot than OCP, and they firmly believed that they didn't need any humanity in a killing machine. Once fully ready, Ed 2000X would be sold to the highest bidder. Killian was impressed with Mason because the first thing Mason asked him was related to payment. A man with no morals is a man who can achieve greatness in the world of crime. But Killian committed the mistake of revealing his history with OCP to Mason. He even revealed how he was using Detroit as a testing ground to show his new buyers the kind of fun and exciting hardware he had. By now, Lewis had reached Jansen's house and was greeted by Jansen's daughters, the elder Shay and the younger Abby. Jansen was telling Lewis that she knew Killian was well connected, and for that reason, she had to quit going after him, which of course infuriated Lewis because she was not one to let go of criminals. Back at Killian's den, he got to know that Mason was in fact an undercover cop. He was going to use Mason to set an example for OCP and the cops. But in the good news department, Robocop was getting a secret upgrade from Dr. Tyler. In fact, he was going to get new legs, which would allow the super cop to run instead of walking slowly with thumps. The snitch. Wyatt and his men stopped an OCP vehicle carrying machine parts, which could have adverse implications for Killian's plans. One of the guys opened the truck. Yep, it was carrying machine parts, but it was not just a machine. It was Robocop, all new and upgraded. One kick from the cyborg cop and Wyatt's man lost his head. With the new upgrade, Robocop managed to put an end to Ed 2000X. And Detective Jansen even caught Wyatt while making a run for it. Back at the precinct, the worst came to place as Killian sent Mason's scarred corpse back to the station. But Wyatt was not one to budge easily, and Lewis knew that. She believed this whole interrogation was an absolute waste of time, because Killian's men would usually die before opening their mouths. However, Wyatt had a weak will, and told Robocop exactly where the stolen OCP products were, including more Ed 2000Xs. Killian was initially infuriated with this whole thing, but he had a plan in mind. But in another major development, Lewis found camera footage of Killian shooting Hutch. At the precinct, cops were charged with finally taking down Killian. Although they didn't have enough evidence against him for killing Mason, they could hold him responsible for theft from the OCP and masterminding the bank robbery. In a moment of transformation, OCP's old man returned Robocop's weapon and agreed that he'd been letting Killian manipulate him for far too long. Things were about to get wild from now on. The cops charged into Killian's den, but Killian's men were ready for the cops. It was an ambush, and many lost their lives. Detroit War Zone. The first few panels of the 7th issue were filled with words like bang, blam, and boom. Bullets filled the room, and there was hardly anything that the cops could do against Ed 2000X, but Robocop was holding onto his ground, unbudged and unfazed. In the end, Robocop used a dead criminal as a shield, braved the onslaught to get underneath Ed 2000X, picked up the robot, and smashed it on the floor. But one of the guys fired an RPG at Robocop. The poor guys were quick to rejoice about killing Robocop, but they couldn't be more wrong. Nevertheless, Robocop rose up once again, as he always does. He read the damned rights to the men who had just shot him up with an RPG. That's a man who deserved to be called Robocop. Unfortunately, by now, the enforcement droid 2000X had managed to get back on its robotic feet. Robocop had observed one massive design flaw in his adversary. If he stayed too close, Ed 2000X couldn't fire his guns at him, which allowed him to use his newfound speed and strength to finally rip the Ed 2000X into pieces. After this, none of the others tried to fight Robocop and surrendered. Meanwhile, Killian was holding a press conference, intending to take down OCP with him. But just as he started another one of his inflammatory speeches, the huge screen behind him started playing the footage of Killian killing Hutch. Clearly, Lewis was behind defacing Killian for the people of Detroit. But you know how it is. Sometimes the mob loves a bit of demagogy. So instead of believing their eyes and ears, they believed their hearts. Killian was an innocent man who was being framed. It wasn't before long that the cops and Killian pulled their guns against each other. Seeing that there was no way to save himself from such damning evidence, he tried to make a run for it, only to be apprehended by Robocop. Meanwhile, the precinct was in a state of mess. You see, Dr. Taylor had lost her job because she helped Lewis retrieve the footage of Hutch's murder. Detective Jansen and the Sarge were grilling Lewis for being responsible for the loss of someone's livelihood. But this affected Robocop as well. His fight with Ed 2000X had damaged him quite a lot, and he was in need of immediate repairs. With Taylor gone, there was no one to fix him. Furthermore, the Sarge said that Robocop's constant repairs were costing the department a lot of money, so if a crime was committed in Detroit and Robocop was needed, he'd be coming as is. Meanwhile, Killian was being transferred to an OCP facility. For someone who hated OCP so much, it was funny they had to go to an OCP-controlled prison. Nevertheless, the cops taking him said things like prison was more than an animal like Killian deserved. This instigated Killian, who was called an animal, and he lost whatever cool he had in himself. In the back seat, Killian was creating a ruckus, so the cops stopped to restrain him. However, he overpowered one of them, took his gun, and shot him in the guts. It wasn't before long that he went on to kill the other cop as well. Killian's monologue at this point reveals that he indeed believed that whatever he was doing, trying to bring OCP down and all that, he was doing it out of love for the people of Detroit. Down with OCP. With Lewis gone to serve as a detective, Robocop's new partner was a man named Kaplan, who was, in my opinion, pretty despicable. Nevertheless, Killian had vanished after killing 2 officers in broad daylight, but Robocop and Lewis were still looking for leads. But unfortunately, all these leads were turning out to be false, or worse, a trap for Robocop. Robocop and Kaplan went to look into another one of such leads, but it was a trap. At first, Robocop was incapacitated using electricity. Then he had to face another barrage of gunfire and even a bazooka. Robocop somehow managed to get a hold of himself, but he was shocked to see who his attackers were, a mother and 2 of her children. Of course, they had to arrest them, but this also pissed off the people of Detroit. Interestingly, the mayor arrived at the spot to find out why cops were arresting women and children, but he was not welcome there. The people hated everyone with authority who was not named Killian. So yeah, he received a glass of cola on his head, and he wasn't happy about it. Lewis and Robocop had started to sense a deeper connection between Killian and OCP, but Killian's past before his first arrest was non-existent on paper. He was a ghost. Finding Killian was becoming a task, but that somewhat changed when Killian appeared on live television and on every channel. This public appearance of his went undisturbed and uninterrupted by Robocop. Killian revealed to the citizens how OCP had set up security cameras all over the city without the knowledge of the people. You see, OCP had done it to check the efficiency of the police force before OCP decided to take over the force. But Killian gave it a completely different spin and made it all about the rights and privacy of the people being exploited. And this was beginning to take the shape of a major uprising. Killian's real history. To counter this smear campaign, OCP launched a campaign of their own in which the old man was reassuring the public about how OCP is dedicated to the protection of the people and nothing more. But things were spiraling out of control, with men, women and children taking to the streets to torch police cars and government buildings. On the other hand, a large crowd was gathering outside OCP. The junior executives were losing their minds, but the old man insisted that they stay at the headquarters, which was apparently built like a fortress, and moving to their office in Cleveland was also not an option. By now, the slogans were against everyone in authority, including OCP, the cops, and Robocop. To make matters worse, Killian was still at large. He had to be caught if any progress had to be made toward bringing peace back. Lewis and Jansen decided to go to the records department to look for leads and information on Killian. And finally, they hit the jackpot. Detroit was not always as bad as it is now. Yep, there was still a lot of darkness back in the day, but there was a lot of light too. OCP's old man's father loved the city. He was idly rich, so he could afford to spend his days as a gentleman and his nights as a monster who dwelled on drugs and women. He had a wife and a son, but he also had a bastard son from his family named Kay Highland. One day, the young kid couldn't take the abuse any longer, and so could the father of the old man. While the young old man's life went to hell after losing all the money, the bastard child had an improvement in life at the orphanage. When the two brothers finally met, they discovered they both shared their father's darkness and the love for that darkness, especially when it came to guns and money. The old man, the older of the two brothers, shares his dream of a better tomorrow. A place where men of means decide what is darkness and what is light, and who is allowed to enjoy either. So they began working together, one in darkness and one in light, all for the dream and the rewards of Delta City. Except that dream was all-consuming for the old man. More and more, it required concealing the darkness and the troublesome past. The old man got scared, and his brother got sloppy. Ultimately, the old man betrayed his brother in deference to the common dream, and his brother stayed hidden for a long time, waiting and planning his revenge. The ladies had finally discovered that Killian was, in fact, Killian Highland, the bastard brother of OCP. And now, Killian wanted OCP and its legacy for himself by eliminating the old man. He arrived at City Hall and took down the mayor after retrieving the central codes for the prison from him. Additionally, a group of mobsters attacked the precinct because the OCP owned the police and they saw the precinct as another OCP branch. The Sarge ordered the precinct to be evacuated, but Robocop wanted to stay back and fight. You see, he knew that OCP and Killian had made him the scapegoat, and now he wanted to give the public just what they wanted: his life. The Sarge couldn't stop Murphy, even if he wanted to, so he let him be. However, Kaplan approached Robocop and tried to show him the folly in his actions and decisions. Killian had the cops and everyone else on the ropes, and Robocop was just exactly what Killian wanted. They had little to no idea why Killian murdered the mayor or why he was orchestrating the riots to spread the cops too thin. Naturally, Killian was planning something big. Kaplan managed to put some sense into Robocop and convinced him out of this suicide mission. On the other hand, Killian freed the prisoners and converted them into loyal members of his army. Final war. The cops were spread across the city to suppress the several riots taking place, but the bulk of the force found itself defending OCP, a company they didn't even believe in. In fact, some of their colleagues were among the people protesting. The escaped convicts had all sorts of weapons at their disposal, but the cops had something more, something better. They had Robocop. He jumped from a chopper, landing on a felon and smashing him to the pulp. That's called stamping out crime in style. Robocop was all the backup the cops needed. The morale had been boosted to infinite levels. Lewis and Jansen joined the fray, launching an all-out assault on the bad guys. Killian took a shot at Lewis, but Jansen came between the bullet and Lewis. Thankfully, she wasn't mortally wounded. Slowly and steadily, the cops started to gain the upper hand, but by now, Killian and some of his men had infiltrated OCP headquarters. Clearly, they wanted the old man's head. The Sarge ordered Robocop to go after Killian and assured that the cops would take care of the situation outside. Robocop found himself being awaited by Wyatt, who had been released along with the others and a few more men in orange. Wyatt detonated a bomb, injuring Robocop more than he already was. Meanwhile, Killian entered the boardroom and ordered everyone to leave. Killian was pointing his gun at the old man when Robocop arrived, telling Killian that he was under arrest. With Robocop in the room, we had the man, the machine, and the monster. The old man asked Robocop to take Killian down, but Robocop was not going to fight for either of the brothers. Their personal war had plunged the city and its people into absolute anarchy. Killian's long game had finally come to a close. OCP's reputation had been destroyed by Killian. However, the people persevered. The cops did their job on the outside, and it was time for Robocop to put the final nail in the coffin of this chaos. Just as Killian was about to pull the trigger, Robocop shot Killian's gun while holding a hand, obliterating his fingers. Unfortunately enough, Robocop was still unaware of Killian and the old man's shared past. He was unaware that OCP had its funding through illegal arms sales and that the two men before him were brothers. Killian tried to reason with Robocop, telling him that the old man was simply using him as a weapon of choice. But the old man asked Robocop to work with him and save Detroit by killing Killian. Nevertheless, Robocop arrested Killian and read him his rights. However, the old man did not want Killian to leave the building. He wanted Robocop to hand Killian over to OCP security, but Robocop would have none of it. He was sure that Killian was going with him, one way or another. But Robocop didn't know that the old man actually controlled Robocop. He overrode Robocop's system and forced him to shut down. The old man went on to kill his brother, and Killian found himself falling through the glass wall. The old man shut Robocop down and wanted a new Robocop to roam the streets. Killian was hailed as a martyr, and the real heroes were left in the shadows. But that was the job. However, Lewis confronted the old man and told him that she knew about his secret. She threatened him that if anything happened to her, the information would find its way to the media. Lastly, she wanted Robocop back at the precinct, this time without any failsafes or hidden directives. In the end, Robocop was back at the precinct, ready to fight whatever monsters came his way. Marvelous verdict. Many claim that Robocop never had a truly great comic. Sure, that Robocop vs. Terminator crossover by Simonson and Miller was okay, but it felt more like a weird mashup that didn't quite hit the Robocop or Terminator mark. If you were looking for that original Robocop movie vibe, it was a miss. The Marvel series? Cool in its own way, but it didn't quite capture the movie's essence. As for the various miniseries, they ranged from meh to facepalm inducing. Now, Boom Studios did a couple of smart things with their new Robocop comic. First, they set it immediately after the 1987 movie, cutting ties with all the mediocre and lackluster continuity bits. Second, and this is crucial, they didn't tap Frank Miller to write it. That's a win because Frank Miller's track record with Robocop isn't great, and folks should have figured that out many years ago. He just can't get into the Robocop groove, and yet he kept landing writing gigs for the character since the early 90s. But that's just my opinion, and you're welcome to challenge it. So yeah, I think this was a great Robocop story, something that would have worked wonders in theaters. What do you think? And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one, and be safe. Thanks everyone.